Hi, my name is Jo Cotterill and I'm a social worker. I've been in private practice since 2017 and I've been a social worker since 2000. I wanted to talk to you briefly about some of the problems I see with social workers' attitudes around private practice. And this is pretty pervasive, and I would really like you to take a moment to think about which of these you might think are true for yourself and reflect on whether or not they can be changed. So the first sort of myth or attitude that I often come across with social workers in private practice is this sense that social workers in private practice only really serve the rich and the privileged, and because of this, they're not really social workers addressing social injustice. I can say from personal experience that I've been in private practice for 9 years now, and 99% of my clients never paid me a cent. I was able to help them find ways of gaining access to government funding because they had a disability, or they were a victim of crime, or they were a veteran or a family member of a veteran, or they could get paid for through their work. And so in reality, a lot of the clients that I saw actually were living in poverty. There were many clients that I saw that didn't know how they would pay their rent or how they would be able to afford the groceries on the table. So you can go into private practice and still continue to support and serve some of the most disadvantaged in society. The second myth that I often see with social workers coming across in private practice is that you have to work ridiculously long hours in order to be in private practice. This is also not true. I'm currently coming to you from my caravan. The blurred background might not show that to you properly, but I travel Australia with my husband and work part-time, and that's a lifestyle that suits me, and I can still change what my income is based on all sorts of different configurations that really aren't available to social workers who work for government departments. So for me, I work 2 days a week, and you don't have to work long hours. You might be wanting to work less hours, and that also doesn't mean that you have to earn less money. There's a myth that social workers in private practice have to work really hard in order to earn the same money. You do have to work, you can't not work, but you don't have to necessarily work long hours. There are all sorts of options available to you, and if you haven't found the option that works right for you yet, that's probably because you haven't learned enough about what private practice can entail, or been brave enough to trial particular things. Another myth that I come across quite commonly about social workers in private practice is that you have to be an accredited mental health social worker. Now, there are certainly types of private practice that really benefit from having accredited mental health social work status, but I know plenty of private practitioners who do not have accredited mental health social work status and who really run their business quite well. In fact, there are some types of private practice that where being an AMHSW is basically of no use to you, especially if you're specializing in, family therapy, or if you're specializing in working with disabilities or other things that don't require focused psychological strategies. And even if you are wanting to do counseling, there are plenty of models that allow for counseling without Medicare approval. Please do not take this as me saying that you should not become an AMHSW, but it is certainly not the thing that you have to do before going into private practice if that's what's holding you back. The myth that I often hear about social workers in private practice is this idea that you're effectively just a psychologist, that you're somehow reduced to becoming a psychologist rather than a social worker. I think this is probably one of the most unfair of all the myths about private practice, and also one of the most pervasive. Social workers bring a really unique perspective to their work, as I'm sure you know as a social worker. We're able to see an individual not only as about how they think, but also about the environment that they're in. And we're able to look at the way that the environment that they're in interacts with who they are and interacts with the government systems around them. For me, I consider myself a radical social worker. And for me, as a radical social worker, I believe that not being in private practice means that I am stuck to working within a government system or a government-funded NGO, working under their rules and guidelines. And while that may give me a certain amount of comfort and security, it also by definition means that I am working within the system. And you can never totally be outside of a system, but as a social worker in private practice, I'm able to step further outside of that system than I would be working for a government or NGO. And I would say that as a radical social worker, not going into private practice is actually something that you should question about why it is that you're accepting work that really is defined and clearly restricted by governments who want to have certain controls over population. The other thing about going into private practice as a social worker is, as you know, there are lots of social work jobs in government departments and in non-government departments. And if you're a skilled and experienced social worker, going into private practice allows you to specialize in the area where you're skilled and where you're experienced. And while you are able then to increase your own quality and skills within the area that you love, you are also effectively freeing up a job for another social worker. So across the whole system, you're increasing capacity. When I left working in mental health and went into private practice, I created a vacancy in mental health that has been filled. And at the same time, I then created a position in private practice where clients could access where there was no services beforehand. So by going into private practice, I would argue that actually you're not a psychologist, you're changing the system. You're working with clients in a different way. You're helping them to work with and challenge the systems and get through the systems in a way that psychologists don't even understand. And frankly, a lot of psychologists tell me that they wish they had my skills around this. And I believe that you're also being a radical social worker. You're not becoming a capitalist. You're actually going out of working for government departments and giving yourself the freedom to get income from all sorts of different sources. The final myth that I often hear from social workers in private practice is, oh, I don't know enough to go into private practice. Now, it is true that social workers don't get very good training about how to run businesses or social enterprises. And that's why I'm so passionate about running Social Work Academy. But you do know enough social work skills to go into private practice. If you've been a social worker for more than 5 years, don't let your own sort of imposter syndrome make you believe that you don't have the social work skills to go into private practice. The gap around running a business is there's a gap in that knowledge, but it's definitely a gap that you can fill. If you can learn how to operate through all the different government systems that you've learned to operate through, you can learn how to operate a private practice. And look, now is a great time to go into private practice, whether or not you're wanting to transition into specializing, or you're wanting to transition into some leave for yourself or some care for yourself, or you just want to do what you're most passionate about or make the biggest difference that you can in society. Now's a great time to do it, especially as the financial year changes. So take a few seconds and maybe reflect on those common myths, I guess. You have to work long hours. You can only serve the rich and not do social justice. You have to be an AMHSW. You don't know enough, and you're somehow sort of diminished to a psychologist. None of those things are true. Don't buy into them. Seriously consider going into private practice if you're a skilled social worker. You may actually be changing the system and improving life for yourself, for the community, and society as a whole by doing it.